Other devoted Talmidim of the Shir, who are very sweet, who were unable to attend all of the chazanas over the summer, and wish the Silber Mishpacha much happiness, health, and shalom, mazel tov, and shana tova. Beautiful, from Eretz Yisrael. Our week of learning sponsors, Nancy and David Berkowitz, in celebration of their son Jonathan's recent engagement to Rachel Harris. Mazel tov to the Chas and Kala, B'Yizochem Yerz Hashem, to build the Bayis Ne'eman B'Yisrael. With that, let us begin. Baruch Hashem again, and welcome back to the Zoom Chavra. Sorry about yesterday again. So wonderful to be back with everyone. Another great daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is daf Tes 9. We are picking up on Chesma Beis 8b, and we are picking up in Yerz Hashem 2, 4, 6, 8 lines up from the bottom. Tan Rabbanon, Hiskatshi li b'mona. Right? So man says to a woman, become Mikudeshes to me with this mana, and she says to him, Tneib al gabe sela. She says to him, go put it on a rock. Go put it on a rock. So what's the status? In the Mikudeshes. So both say, again, we look at these statements as she's not accepting the Kiddushin. So both say, put it on a rock is like the Talmudic equivalent of go fly a kite, right? You know, right? Put it on a rock. But however, if vim haya sela shalah, but if it was her rock, then Mikudeshes. Ultimately, again, she is betrothed. By Rabbi asked the following Shaila: Sela shel shnei mahu. What happens if the rock belongs to both of them? They have a jointly owned rock. So what happens if she would tell him then to put the Kiddushin on the rock? Teku. Okay, Eliyahu Navi. His kachli bikikar. Go ahead and literally, so man says to a woman, so become Mikudeshes to me with this loaf of bread. So she says to him, Tineo lekelev. Go give it to a dog. Somebody says, okay, pretty clear indication. Eino Mikudeshes, right? That is not an acceptance of Kiddushin, not Mikudeshes. Now watch this. Vimhaya kelev shalah Mikudeshes. Now if it was her dog, right, and thereby essentially he's feeding her animal, then halacha l'maisa, she's Mikudeshes. Because in that case, again, he's giving her benefit. By Rav Mari, listen to this. Kelev ratz achareha mahu. So what happens? Listen to this. What happens if he says, become Mikudeshes to me with this loaf of bread? She's being chased by a dog. She says, give it to the dog. Give it to the dog. This woman could clearly multitask, right? So she's being chased by a dog, right? She's getting right. Give it to the dog. So what's the halacha ma'u? So do we say on one hand, since he is providing her benefit, namely again, he's saving her. He's saving her, right? So the fact that she's being saved by this loaf of bread, so ultimately, again, that's her commitment to the Kiddushin. Or she could say to him, no, I'm not married to you. You're also obligated to save me, right? Remember, again, there's a biblical obligation of if you see someone in danger, you are obligated to intervene and try to help. So again, she says, you're halachically obligated to try to save me as well. So you are obligated to give the loaf of bread to the dog in order to help save me. And therefore, I'm not Mikudeshes to you. To which the Gemara says, Teku. Okay. So the Gemara leaves this open as well. Next, his kachili bikikar. So what happens if Reuben goes over to Rachel? He says, become Mikudeshes to me with this loaf of bread. So she says to him, Tneu la'ani. Just go give the loaf to a poor person. So what's the halacha? Eina Mikudeshes. Ultimately, again, she's not Mikudeshes. Because also, again, there's two things over here, which is number one, that statement of give it to the ani in and of itself is viewed as her deferring him, right? She's saying, go do something else with this kikar. Furthermore, again, she's not getting any benefit from it. What happens, however, afilu ani asamuch. They both say, let's say it is an ani who is dependent on her. So, for example, let's say again, so Reuven says to Rachel, become Mikudeshes to me with this loaf of bread. She says, give it to Shimon. Shimon happens to be her brother, right, or her family member whom she supports. So this is an ani who depends on her. So Lamaisa, one can make the argument that when Reuven gives the loaf of bread to Shimon, Rachel is getting benefit from that. She's deriving benefit because otherwise this would have been a loaf that she would have been obligated to provide. So the Gemara says, Afilu ani asamuchala, even if it is an ani who is financially dependent on Rachel, she's still not Mikudeshes. My time, but what's the reason? Amrale, because Rachel could say to Reuven, because she could say to him, listen, the same way that I'm obligated to help Shimon, guess what? So are you. So are you, right? You're also obligated. So by you giving a loaf of bread, ultimately again to Shimon, even though I'm normally the person who goes ahead and supports Shimon, Lemaisa. But we just spoke about the din of Arvos, right? So the Lemaisi, you have the same obligation to help out a fellow Jew as I do. Therefore, again, I'm not Mikudeshes. She's not deriving any specific benefit from that. Okay. So the Gemara says, so therefore, in that case, Rabbi say, interestingly enough, so whether she tells him to just give it to an ani stam, right? Or she tells him give it to an ani who she is supporting, either way, not Mikudeshes. How Gavra? Interesting case here, I will say. Hugavra, the hava kamizab in top of tes, chumri paschaisa. So there was a guy, Rashi has two interpretations ultimately again of what chumri paschaisa means. Let's just go with the second one, which is there was a guy who was selling glass beads. Glass beads. Okay, so top of tes, 9a. Asai hahi isisa. So a woman walked into the store. Amrale, havli chad shucha. She said to him, give me one string of glass beads. All right, he says to her, Amrala, iahivna lech mikadeshesli. So he says to her, you know what, if I give it to you, will you become mikudeshes to me? All right, good. Good customer service, right? I think actually, so Amrale, she says to him, hava mihava. So she says to him, give it to me. Now both say hava mihava is a double lashon, which means give it to me. Right? Okay, give it to me. So Rav Chama says, call hava mihava lav klumhu. So I'll say essentially, so Rav Chama says, any give it to me is not a statement of acquiescence to Kiddushin. Others will say, you know how we translate hava mihava? How do you translate it? Just give it to me. Right? Just give it to me. In other words, she's not interested in the Kiddushin. She's saying, I just came into the store for a string of glass beads, not a marriage proposal. Just give me the glass beads. And ultimately, again, there's no Kiddushin. Next case. Ho Gavra, another good case. Ho Gavra, Dahavakashasi Chamra Bechanusa. There was a guy who was drinking a glass of wine in a store. Asai hahi isisa. A woman walked in. Amrale havli chad kasa. So apparently this guy must have, I guess either he was the proprietor of the store or she thought it was the proprietor of the store. So what happens? So she says to him, can I have a glass of wine? Amrala iahivni leich mikadeshesli. If I give you a glass of wine, will you become mikudeshes to me? Amrale ashkuye ashkian. She said, give me to drink. Give me to drink. Amrav Chama, kol ashkuye ashkiyan lav klumhu. So again, all this lashon of just give me to drink means just give me the glass of wine. I'm not interested in your marriage proposal. Okay, next case. Hu Gavra. There was a guy who was removing dates from palm trees. We'll say, the way you remove dates from palm trees is usually, again, either you're up in the tree, hitting the branches, or you're shaking the tree, or hitting the branches from below. Point is, he's removing dates from the palm tree. So a woman walked by. Amar, she said to him, Shadi li tarti, can I have 2 dates? Can I have 2 dates? Amrale, ishadina lacha mikadeshesli. So he says to her, if I give you the dates, tell me, will you become mikudeshes to me? Amrale, shadi mishta. Give me the dates. So Amrav Zivid, kol shadi mishta lav klumhu. Ultimately, again, any lashon like this of just give me the dates, ultimately is not a lashon of Kiddushin. Not a lashon of Kiddushin. Good. So I'll say, so good. 3 cases, all pretty much saying the same basic idea, which is that halacha l'maisa in these cases where woman walked in order to acquire an item. Man offers to give the item, but offers to give it in the context of Kiddushin. She says, give it to me. Give it to me does not translate into an acceptance of his Kiddushin offer. Right? Give it to me ultimately means give it to me. Give me the item that I came in for and nothing more. So now the Gemara asks an interesting follow-up question over here. Hav ashki v'shadi mao. Now both say, if you notice, in all of these cases, so the way the woman answered was with a double lashon. Right? For example, in the case of the glass beads, she said to him, hava mehava. Right? In the case of the wine, she said to him, ashkuye ashkiyan. And in the case of the dates, she said to him, shadi mishta. Now, so the question I think Gemara is asking is, do we say that that the rejection of the Kiddushin offer is manifest in the double lashon of just give me it, right? The double lashon of is that what's happening over here? But perhaps had she just said in this without a double lashon, right? Give me the beads, right? Give me the beads, or give me the wine, or give me the dates. Maybe had she just said that's have ashki v'shadi mahu. So as well say, we're trying to just sparse the words a little bit. Is it the double lashon of give that indicates her rejection of the kiddushin offer, and all she's interested in is obtaining the object? But had she used a more singular lashon of giving, that ultimately that could have been an acceptance, or it doesn't make a difference? Ravina Mikudeshes. So Ravina said, this is very interesting. Ravina said, if she just uses a singular lashon of give me, right? In other words, not have me hava, but just have. Not ashkuyi ashkiyan, but just ashki. And not shadi mishte, but just shadi. That actually would be an acceptance of Kiddushin, which I will say is a huge chiddush, because then, according to Ravina, what's happening over here is that even though she's not even verbally acknowledging the Kiddushin offer, right? All she's saying is give. Ravina says that's enough. That's enough. Rav Sama Baraksa Amar. Rav Sama Baraksa Amar Taga de Malka. We'll say Taga de Malka literally means by the crown of the king. That's like a lashon of shua, like by the crown of the king. Eina Mikudeshes. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. See, I will say. Rav Sama Baraksa essentially saying is, look contextually what's happening over here, right? The woman is entering into a commercial setting or whatever, or entering into a transactional framework in order to obtain something. The guy is springing a Kiddushin offer upon her. This is not her context at all, right? This is not, so whether she uses a double lashon, a singular lashon, she is not Mikudeshes. V'hilchasa, Shabbos say, what's the halacha? Eina Mikudeshes. So I will say, so number one, halacha l'maisa, in these cases, she is not going to be mikudeshes. So I will say, so in any of these cases, whether she uses a double lashon or uses a singular lashon, she is not mikudeshes. That's number one. Now, we're going to do three halachas over here. Number two, the hilchasa, shirai lo tzrich ishuma. But say halacha number two is that silk does not require appraisal. So I will say this is going back to yesterday's daf, really already Sunday's daf, the machlokes Rabbah and Rav Yosef about if a man goes ahead and gives a woman a piece of silk and is mekadesh with the piece of silk, does the piece of silk require a shuma? Does it require evaluation? So the Gemara here is saying it does not. Now, if you remember again, we already saw the Rambam. The Rambam says it does not require valuation, but what does it require? It does require the husband to tell the wife how much it's worth. And assuming that the husband is telling the truth, it doesn't require another independent valuation. But if you're being mekadesh with an object, Rabbi say this is why I mentioned this yesterday or Sunday. This is why halacha l'maisa under the chuppah, when we use a ring, we ask the chassan, is it worth at least the pruta? That's what we're asking, because when the kala is getting married, what she is committing to is the evaluation of an object at a pruta and no more. Right? How much it's worth, how much it's not worth, we're not concerning ourselves with that, just the pruta. So the halacha is that when you're mekadesh with silk, it doesn't require an additional independent valuation. And next, the hilchasa Rabbi Lazar. The halacha follows Rabbi Lazar. They will say, what's Rabbi Lazar? Take a look at Rashi. V'chsak Rabbi Lazar. Damris kachli b'mana v'nasan ladinar harezim mikudeshes v'yashlim. So Rabbi say this is another great case. Remember we had this yesterday. Yesterday, right? That if a man says to him, become mikudeshes to me with a mana, right? Let's say a man says, become mikudeshes to me with $100, and he gives her $5. What's the halacha? She's mikudeshes, and he's obligated to pay her the rest. And I will say the halacha follows Rava in the name of Rav Nachman, namely that if a man says to a woman, become mikudeshes to me with a mana, and he gives her a mashkon, he gives her collateral, right? She is not mikudeshes. So let's remember again, going back to yesterday's daf. There are two different types of collateral. One type of collateral where if you default on payment, you get to keep the collateral. The other type of collateral, which is just like a sign of good faith. We assume that when a man is mekadesh woman with a mana, it says become mekadesh with a mana, it gives your collateral, it's good faith collateral. Well, good faith collateral is halachically meaningless. Halachically meaningless. Therefore, again, should not be mekadesh. Therefore, I will say, this is great. By the way, this doesn't happen all that often, where you get 4 statements of halacha l'maisa in rapid succession. So, so again, halacha number one, that in all of these cases where a woman walks into a situation, a transactional situation, asks for something, man says, will you become mikudeshes to me? She says, give it to me. Whether she says it in a singular lashon or a double lashon, not mikudeshes. That's number one. I will say, halacha l'maisa, man is mekadesh with an object. Object does not require independent valuation as long as husbands share the actual value of the item. Halacha number 3, halacha l'hazar b'lazar, namely, again, if you're mekadesh woman with a mana and you give her $5 of it, she's mikudeshes and he owes her the rest. Halacha number 4, mekadesh woman with a mana, give her a mashkon, she is not mikudeshes. Incredible. So it's a little bit of a hybrid. In other words, we paskin ultimately again, really like Rabbah. But again, like I said in yesterday's daf, the Rambam holds that the husband does have to tell the wife how much the item is worth. So it doesn't require an independent valuation, but she does have to know the value of the object. So it's really Rabbah. Okay, well, so let's go back there. Tan Rabbanon. Mishtar Ketzad. So I'll say, so now what we're doing over here is we are moving into the other forms of Kiddushin, right? We've been heavily focused really on Kesef this entire time. What about Shtar? What about the use of a document to affect Kiddushin? So Tan Rabbanan. Mishtar Ketzad. So how does one affect Kiddushin with shtar? So kasav lo al niyar al acheres. If a man writes a document, and Rabbi said, by the way, the document is pretty simple. What's the document? Right? Hari'at mikudeshes li b'shtar zu kidas Moshe v'Yisrael. Now obviously you're putting the names of the parties in it, right? Hari'at mikudeshes, right? Hari'at Rachel mikudeshes li Ruvain, right? B'shtar zu, and that's it. So the Gemara says, b'shtar ki, so kasav lo al niyar al acheres. If you write on a piece of paper, or remember, usually refers to unprocessed parchment, or al acheres, or on earthenware, even though the document itself is not worth a pruta, right? As opposed to kesef, where the vehicle of kiddushin must be worth at least a pruta, by shtar that's not the case, right? By shtar halacha l'maisa. By shtar halacha, even if it's not worth a pruta, it works. And what do you write on it? So we'll say bitcha mikudeshesli, bitcha meuresesli, bitcha li leintu harezim mikudeshes. So we'll say, so the example they're giving over here of shtar is where a man is being mekadesh, let's say a nara. Right, so a nara, her father still has rights over her. So in this case, again, the shtar is really written towards the father. Right, so you have Ruvain writing this towards the father of Rachel. Your daughter is mikudeshes to me. Your daughter is mu'ureses to me. Your daughter is to me as a wife. So that works. So maskif Rabbi Zera bar Mamel halo dami hayshtar l'shtar zvini. So we'll say this is fascinating. Here's the problem. The shtar, as you're explaining it, does not resemble a typical transactional shtar. Now we'll say, why is that? Hasam mocher kosev lo, sadai mechur lecha, hacha bal kosev bitcha mikudeshasli. Now we'll say, watch this. In a typical transaction, who's writing the document? Seller. Right? So we'll say, so in other words, the person who is conveying ownership of something is the one who's writing the document. Here in the case of Kiddushin, who's writing the document? The acquirer, so to speak. So the Gemara says, 1 second, like, so we'll say, see, the paradigmatic example of shtar is not Kiddushin, right? The paradigmatic example of shtar is commerce, is business. So if in business, ultimately, again, it's the seller, the one who's conveying ownership of something to another party, is the one who's writing the shtar. Here, it's the acquirer, to which the Gemara says, so hacha bal kosei bitcha mikudeshasli amarava hasem inyan adikra hacham inyan adikra. So the Gemara says very simply, you're right. It's two different shtaras, and in both situations, the shtar reflects the subject of the pasuk. How so? Hasem ksiv umachar me'achuzaso. I will say ultimately again, by a sale of an item, the Torah phrases it as the seller. Umachar me'achuzaso. He will sell of his portion. B'mocher talarachmana. The Torah, in speaking about normal commerce, right? Although it's talking about over here, a person sells themselves. Umachar me'achuzaso. I'm sorry, the person sells of his ancestral land. So I'll say the Torah phrases it as the seller. So hachal ksiv kiikach. Here, when it comes to Kiddushin, so Torah phrases this as, again, as we've seen before a number of times already, a husband-driven process. So therefore, I will say the Gemara just simply says the shtar works different ways in different contexts, right? So in a typical transactional situation, Torah speaks about the seller. By marriage, it speaks about the husband. Hasam namik sev sados bakesef yiknu. But by purchases, by sales, it also says they will sados bakesef yiknu, talking about the purchaser. So maybe it's the purchaser who's right the shtar, to which the Gemara says kari ba yaknu. Don't read it as yiknu, rather read it as yaknu. Yaknu means to convey ownership. My time akar is be yaknu, mishum dechsev umachar. So we'll say, so again, why is it that you're revocalizing the word as yaknu, which means to convey ownership? Because of the previous pasuk that said umachar, which tells us that again, when it comes to sales, right, we focus much more on the seller than on the buyer from a shtar perspective. Hachenami karibei kiyakach. Why don't you just go ahead and read it as instead of kiyikach, kiyakach. Kiyakach means, would be referring to the woman, dichsev, as biti nasati leish hazeh. Because also even by marriage, we have a pasuk that says, right, the father says, I gave my daughter to this man, which clearly indicates that what? That halacha l'maisa, it is the father, so to speak, who's driving the process. So I will say, the point the Gemara is making over here is, if you're looking at psukim, you have psukim that go both ways. You have psukim from a sale perspective. Some psukim make a focus on the seller, other psukim make a focus on the buyer, and even by marriage, some psukim make a focus on the husband, and some psukim create a focus ultimately again on the woman. Not really on the woman, but much more call it on the father of the girl, which are from the betrothal side, from the betrothed side. So I will say, so how do you know which shtar should come from who? Ela Amar Rava Hilchas Saninu. Gemara says you're right. Rava says you're right. Rava say this is a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Halacha l'Moshe Sinai va'asmechinu rabbanon akroi. And the psukim being brought down, Rava say, are just being brought down as a support, as a scriptural allusion. So Rava says, so what is the halacha l'Moshe Sinai? This is fascinating. So the halacha l'Moshe Sinai says that by Kiddushin, a shtar Kiddushin ultimately is written by the husband. Right? And the shtar mecher, a sale document, is written by the seller. That's the halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Do we have psukim that seem to support this? Sure, but the psukim themselves are a bit inconclusive because they can go in different directions. The other possibility is Hasam Nami Ksiv, the Ekach as Sefer HaMakneh. Alright, we'll say ultimately again, see here, it says I will take the document of sale, which once again seems to indicate that when it comes to transactions, regular business transactions, sale transactions, the document is written by the seller. Okay, so I'll say, so this is very important. So this Nukuda number one is, we know Mishnah introduced us to the concept that a man can mekadesh his wife with a shtar. What does a shtar kiddushin look like? Essentially, a man writes in a document, Hariat Mikudesh Asli, or if he's writing to the father, Bitcha Mikudesh Asli, Bishtar Zu. How do we know? We'll say, who writes the shtar kiddushin? Who writes it? Who writes it? Husband, right? As opposed to a shtar mecher, a document of sale. Who writes the document of sale? Seller. How do we know that? Halacha l'Moshe Sinai. We have psukim that support that as well, but halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Beautiful. Let's go weiter. V'amar Rav Nachman, Kasavu al niyar al acheres, afal pi she'imo shavapruta, bitcha mikudeshes li, bitcha mureses li, bitcha li leintu. So Rav says, now listen to this. So going back to what we said before. So Rav says, Rav Nachman, when you're writing a shtar, you're writing, whatever you're writing it on, say you're writing it on niyar, on processed parchment, you're even writing on a piece of pottery, a pottery shard, right? Even though the document upon which you are writing it doesn't have an inherent value, and you write on it bitcha mikudeshes li, bitcha mureses li, bitchil into bein al yedei aviha, bein al yedei atzma mikudeshes midaito. Rabbi said, now listen to this. So whether you give it to her or whether you give it to her father, ultimately, again, she will be mikudeshes as long as all of this is being done with the consent of the father. Now, Rabbi says, so obviously, what we're talking about in this particular case is Reuven is marrying Rachel, and Rachel is either what? She's either what? A ketana or a nara, right? So remember, if you want to marry a ketana or a nara, it must be done with the consent of the father. So technically, if she's a nara, she could receive the shtar with the consent of the father, but everything must be done with the consent of the father. V'hu shalom bagra, and this is assuming she's not a Bulgaris, because what happens when she becomes a Bulgaris? Right, independent woman, father has no rights in her. Fine, that's case one. So we'll say case number two is Reuven writes to Rachel, right, on a piece of paper, on a piece of parchment, or on a cheres, even though the document itself doesn't have any inherent value. Hareat mikudeshesli, hareat into, right, becoming kudeshes means become my wife. Hareat miuresesli, mikudeshes, bein al yedei aviha, bein al yedei atzma. Now, say her father could receive it for her, or she could receive it herself. Vohu shebagra. But this is assuming that she's a Bulgaris. Now, watch this. What does it mean her father could receive it for her? If she's a Bulgaris, Rabbi saying, she could appoint her father as her shaliach. But her father could only receive it for her if halacha l'maisa she consented to that. Right? Remember, once she becomes Rabbi say, so therefore, if we kind of mix all this together, we're learning essentially a couple of halachas. Number one, what we're learning is that Kiddushin, let's go through everything we know. Kiddushin works with shtar. Once again, how do I know that Kiddushin works with shtar? How do I know that? So interestingly enough, we know, we should really take a step back. We know that Kiddushin works with shtar, actually because there's a gzeir shava between Kiddushin and Gittin. V'yatsa v'haisa. That we're going to see that actually inside just a moment. That's actually we referenced that before, right? V'yatsa v'haisa l'shacher. There's a scriptural connection, a scriptural bridge between divorce and kiddushin. And just like divorce is affected with the document, kiddushin, that's actually the real source. That's actually the real source, right? How do I know that the document of kiddushin is written by the husband and not by the wife? How do I know that? That's halacha l'Moshe Sinai, right? What else do I know? The document itself need not have an inherent value. Right? So even if the document itself is not worth a shava pruta, it is still going to work. What else do I know? Halacha l'maisa, if she is a ketana or a nara, that document could only be executed with the consent of the father, which makes sense because Kiddushin needs consent of the father. If halacha l'maisa she is a Bulgaris, it requires her explicit consent. Could her father receive that document on her behalf if she's a Bulgaris? Sure, as long as what? She consents or she appoints him to receive it on her behalf. Incredible. Let's go back to Rabbi said last two lines, Tes Amud Aleph. Boy Rabbi Shmuel Lakish. Shtar Iris and Shekasu Shalol Lishma Mahu. So Rabbi says, so what happens if halacha l'maisa? So Rabbi Shmuel Lakish says, Shtar Irisin, that was written Shalol Lishma. Interesting case. So Reuven writes Rachel a document, the Shtar Irisin, Shalol Lishma. I will say, what does Shalol Lishma means? Right? Reuven always knew that he wanted to marry a woman named Rachel. From the time he was a little boy. Right? I want to marry a woman named Rachel. So what did he do? He wrote the Shtar Irisin long ago, right? For a woman named Rachel, not for this lady that he's marrying, right? So what happens? That is a case of a Shtar Irisin written Shalol Lishma. So Mahu. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Does it work? On one hand, Havia li Yitzias Makshinan. The pasuk itself makes a connection between divorce and marriage. So do we say Ma Yitzia Amid Beis, Ma Yitzia Ba'in Lishma? Just like divorce, you need a document that is written Lishma. Af Havia Ba'in Lishma. So to Rabbi say by Kiddushin, you need a document that is written Lishma. O Dilma Havios Lahadadi Makshinan. Or maybe not. Maybe we'll say we don't compare divorce to marriage. Instead, what we do is we compare the various mechanisms of marriage to one another. Ma via the kesef lo ba'in lishma. I will say when you're mekadosh with kesef, you don't need a special coin minted for the occasion of the erusin of Ruvain to Rachel. Right? What could he do? He could take a pruta out of his pocket and use that for kiddushin. So just like money for kiddushin doesn't require lishma, in other words, the money that havia the shtar lo ba'in lishma. So too, the document need not be written l'shma. So basar debaya hader pashta. After he asked that they answered, havia liyetzia makshina. No, we do compare. So we'll say, by the way, so this is based on the pasuk by Gittin. It says v'yatsa mi beso. She will leave her husband who divorced her. V'haisa liish acher. She'll become married to someone else. So the Torah itself is equating the process of divorce and marriage. So we say Havili Yitzia Makshinan Damakra V'Yatsa V'Haisa. There it is. So we'll say this is incredible. So this is how we pass Halacha L'Maisa. Halacha L'Maisa. When you are being mekadesh with a shtar, the shtar has to be written l'shma. So therefore, what was it? All that means is that remember a shtar kiddushin is actually compared to Gittin is actually a very uncomplicated shtar. But halacha l'maisa, it does have to be written for the purposes of this specific act of kiddushin for these specific people. Incredible. Sorry. Let's go back there. Se'it mar. Kasvu l'shma v'shalom daita. Shabbat says, so what happens? What happens if halacha l'maisa? Kasvu l'shma v'shalom daita. Shabbat says, now watch this case. Let's say Ruvain knows he wants to marry Rachel. This Rachel. So what does he do? He writes the shtar, but she's totally unaware of it. And he's going to surprise her. He's going to take her out, right? Surprise her. Here's your shtar, right? So we'll say, so what happens if halacha l'maisa, he writes it? So again, this is the case of l'shma for her, but show me that she's unaware of it. So Rava and Ravina amr mikudeshes. Rava and Ravina say that she's mikudeshes. It works. Rav Papa Rav Sharbia amr in mikudeshes. Rav Papa and Rav Sharbia say she's not mikudeshes. Okay, not mikudeshes. So amr Rav Papa. So we'll say so fundamental machlokes. We'll say get ready for this. Amr Rav Papa. Rav Papa said, "Eima taima dido, veima taima didi." Rav Papa said, "I'm going to tell you my logic. I'm going to tell you their logic." Right? So we'll say, so Papa is the one who says, ultimately, again, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. Rava and Ravina, it doesn't work. Papa says, I'm going to tell you their opinion. I'm going to explain to you their logic. I'm explaining to you my logic. We'll say, just before we go on, just understand the gadlus of this Gemara. Understand the gadlus of this Gemara. We'll say, so often in life, right, we have a point of view, we have an opinion, and what happens? We are unable to see anyone or anything else. We're unable to see any other point of view. We're just unable. So we'll say, successful relationships require the ability to appreciate and see the other's point of view. You understand the Kalas says Rav Papa is having a machlokes with Rav and Ravina. We'll say, if Rav Papa has a machlokes with Rav and Ravina, what does that mean? What does that mean? Right? How does he view their opinion? As wrong, right? It's a machlokes. When you have machlokes, it means I think I'm right and I think you're wrong. But the godless is, even if you think that someone else is wrong, you have to have the ability to try to understand where they're coming from. Because otherwise, there is no relationship. Otherwise, there is no mutual respect. I will say, is this not everything that is wrong with contemporary society today? Right? I will say, we live in an age where if I disagree with you, I just wholesale reject anything you have to say, and I won't even listen to you. I won't even listen. We're so insecure in our beliefs and in our opinions that we can't even open ourselves up to the ideas of others. Here Rav Papa is arguing with Rava and Ravina, but yet he's saying, I understand where you're coming from. I will say, is this not godless? I understand where you're coming from. I hear, again, totally disagree. And by the way, you're not even going to sway me with your opinions. But I absolutely, unequivocally understand your cover. We'll say, imagine you apply this to Shalom Bayis. Imagine you apply this concept to marriage, and imagine again in a moment of marital argument, or if chas v'shalom, right, marital discord, right? What happens? It happens so often. Couples get entrenched in their opinions. I hold like this, you hold like this. Imagine for a moment you take a couple of moments to understand, where are you coming from? I disagree with you. I think you're wrong. I think you're out of your mind. But let me try to understand where you're coming from. Because look what Papa says. I'll explain to you their reason. I'll explain to you my reasoning. They will say, by the way, not only that, Rabbi Papa starts off by explaining to us the opinion of the others. You know what I'm saying? Shalom is so attainable in every arena in life if you're just willing to open yourself up to other ideas and other perspectives. You don't even have to accept them. You don't have to embrace them. You just have to take the time to understand them. That's all. That's all. Shapapa says, let me explain to you the opposing opinion. The pasuk says, right? Remember, the Torah equates marriage and divorce. So Papa says like this. I understand Rava and Ravina. So Ravina will say this. Rava will say, by a get. What do you need by a get? What do you need by a get? Lishma. What don't you need by a get? What don't you need by a get? Her knowledge. Right, her knowledge. Right, remember again, get is even. See, both say get is even more extreme, because remember, a get could even be given against your will. But lamaisa, you don't need her foreknowledge, right? You don't need her knowledge about it. So too again, there's a halachic bridge between erusin, right, or between marriage and divorce. So that's why Rav Papa says, that's why Rava and Ravina say that a shtar kiddushin written lishma, but shalom midaita, without her knowledge, will absolutely work. So that's the other opinion. I'll tell you my opinion why I think it doesn't work. The Yatsa V'Haisa, yes, the Torah does compare marriage to divorce. Ma Yitzia, Ba'inan das makne. I will say, just by divorce, you need the das of the person, of the makne. The makne also means the person conveying ownership. Now, in divorce, who's the person conveying ownership, quote unquote? It's the husband. In other words, he's relinquishing rights that he has in her property and other things. So just like by divorcing das makne, we'll say first wide line, af havia ba'inan das makne. So to in Kiddushin, you need das makne. We'll say, who's das makne? You need the das of the person conveying ownership. We'll say, who's conveying ownership in a case of marriage? The woman. She's giving herself over, ultimately again, to this relationship. That's Rav Papa. So we'll say, so by the way, both good opinions. I must say, the incredible thing is, when you open your mind up to the opinions of others, you begin to see that people very often do know what they're talking about, right? And there is legitimacy, there is basis to what it is that they're saying. Again, I want to point out, after Rav Papa plumbs the depths of the opinion of Rava and Ravina, he doesn't change his mind, right? It's not like he says, oh, you know what? I agree with you. That makes a lot of sense, right? He doesn't say that. He still holds firm in his opinion. Rabbi say, but he's humble enough, because that's what it's really all about, humility. He's humble enough to open himself up to understand the position and perspective of others. Incredible. So we'll say, may say, first wide line, may say, in close and shtare erusim and isun elamidash ne'en. So I'll say this price seems to be pretty explicit over here, right? So we say that we don't write shtare erusin when he's suing elamidashne without the knowledge of both of them. So we'll say that seems to support Rav Papa. So my love shtare erusin when he's suing mamish. Does that not refer to actual document, right? What we're talking about, shtare erusin? Lo shtare psikta. No, so that's something so totally different. We'll say shtare psikta. We'll say what is shtare psikta? We'll say what they called tinoim, financial agreements between families. Kudrav gidol amarav domarav gidol marav. Kama ata nosin lebincha kach v'kach. So we'll say what would families often do? They would discuss financial matters. The groom's side would say, how much are you giving to your son? You're going to give this amount. Kach v'kach, right? Lebitcha, kach v'kach. The bride's family, how much are you giving to your daughter? Amdu v'kidshu. They would get up, they would do kiddushin. Hein advar mitni bar mira. So we'll say, this is what we call tinaim. Right? What are tinaim? Tinaim are financial agreements between families. So I will say the idea, the Gemara, so therefore, the Gemara said, right, the families would commit. So I will say, so the Gemara says, when the Brisa says before we only write shtari eris and any suin, midas shnehem, that's not talking about a shtar. After the Tanaim, they would go ahead and enter right into Kiddushin. But if halacha l'maisa, there was a gap of time between the Tanaim and the Kiddushin, they would write down the Tanaim. So I will say, we do Tanaim at a wedding today, but if you ever look at the text of the Tanaim, it's very non-specific. Right? Essentially what the Tanaim say is, whatever everyone promised to do, they did. They did. That's why I will say, technically speaking, if you don't do Tanaim, right? If you don't do it, technically speaking, it does. Right? We do it because again, it's Minhag Yisrael. By the Hasidim, they make a much bigger deal about Tanaim, right? About Tanaim. We're entering into actual formal Tanaim. Some of the Sephardic communities, right? They do this as well. Today, in most Ashkenazi communities, it's more like just a formality. I will tell you something interesting. Just, you ever wonder why is it that what do we call an engagement party? What do we call an engagement party? A vart. A vart. Why is an engagement party called a vart? I say, what does vart mean? What does vart mean? A word. Let's say, what did they used to do at a vart? Right? They used to do a vart. They would go ahead and formalize these agreements. We'll say that's what was done as a vart. Rav Gidel says families would make verbal commitments to each other about what they were going to do for the chassan and kala. That's why it's called a vart. Right? It's called a vart. They would enter into verbal commitments. Chassan's family is going to give this. Kala's family is going to give this. And Rav Gidel said these are the kind of things that everybody relied on, verbal commitments. They didn't even put it down in writing. Hence, the vart. Incredible. Let's go weiter. Both say, how do we paskin? So the Rambam paskins ultimately again like Rav Papa, namely that a shtar erusin has to be written, number one, l'shma, and number two, midaita. It has to be written with her knowledge. So if a man is planning a proposal, do not plan a proposal right with a surprise shtar kiddushin. Not going to work. You can do whatever other surprises you want, but the shtar kiddushin has to be written, number one, the shema, and number two, with her knowledge. Incredible. Let's go weiter. Ubabiyah. We'll say mechanism number three for affecting kiddushin is biyah. Minolan. Where do we know that from? Bu'ulas Baal. Torah says bu'ulas Baal. Now it happens to be the context over here is actually adultery, right? The way the Torah refers to a married woman is bu'ulas Baal. Bu'ulas Baal. Malamed shnaseh Baal ayidei be'ilah. That teaches us that Allah Chamaisa becomes married through biyah. All right, I'm going to say so Amrilei Reish Lakish Rabbi Yochanan Keura Zu Sheshaninu Rabbi Uba'ala. So they kind of attacked Rabbi Aval a little bit, and they said, I don't understand why you're looking to that pasuk. Is why do you reject that which Rabbi taught? Uba'ala. The pasuk says Uba'ala. Now both say this is a pasuk by marriage. Ki yikach ish isha uba'ala. If a man will marry a woman and have relations with her, Melamed shidniknis babiyah. I will say that's a pasuk by marriage and much more explicit. It says if a man will marry a woman, ubala, and have relations with her. So you see from here that biyah affects marriage. To which the Gemara says, Rabbi Abba will say, no. Imi hasam hava amina ademekali shvahader baal. I will say based on that pasuk, I would have said that when does biyah work? Maybe biyah only works first if you do some other mechanism of kiddushin, followed by biyah. Because if you look at the lashon of the pasuk, it's ki yikach ish isha uba'ala. So there's two verbs there, right? What are the two verbs? Number one, yikach, and number two, ba'ala. So from that pasuk, I would not necessarily know that biyah actually works as a primary form of kiddushin. So maskev Rabbi Avo bar Mamel, Rabbi Avo. So Rabbi Avo bar Mamel asked the kasha. He says as follows, Imkain. So I'll say, if that's true, that you would think that biyah only works when it's preceded by some other mechanism of kiddushin. So the Gemara says, Imkain nara hamuras rachmana beskila heichim mishkach asla. So we'll say, now listen to this, okay, very quickly. So generally, if a man commits adultery, the death penalty for adultery is chanek, strangulation. What if a man commits adultery with a nara hamu'urasa? Nara hamu'urasa is a girl who is betrothed, who has kiddushin, a woman who has had kiddushin but has not had nisuin. So we'll say the punishment for nara hamu'urasa is skila. is skila. Now, I will say, now the whole chap of Nara Murasa is that she's a basula. She's a basula. The penalty therefore is skila. So the Gemara says like this. The Gemara says, watch this. The Gemara says, if you're going to tell me that bia only works after some other mechanism of Kiddushin, how are you ever going to find the case of Nara Murasa who's punishable by skila? Why? Because if halacha l'maisa you did Kiddushin and there was relations, bu'ulahi. Then Rabbi says she's a bu'ula. When she's a bu'ula, the punishment for adultery with a bu'ula is chenek. Is chenek, is strangulation, not stoning. And ultimately, again, if there was Kiddushin, but there was no bia, then ultimately lav klum. And based on what you just said, Kiddushin is only effective if what? If there's a mechanism for Kiddushin, then bia, then she's nothing. The Rabbanan said before Abaye, Mishkachas la kigon sheba la arus shelo kidarka. Okay, you can have a case of Osai where the arus had bia shelo kidarka. Now Osai bia shelo kidarka is an effective bia, but she's still a basula. She's still a basula, right? The basula is still intact. Amalei Abaye says ad kan lo pligi Rabbi v'Rabbanan ela ba'acher. Supposed to listen to this. So I will say this happens to be a fascinating discussion in general about what is the status of a woman after bia shelo kidarka. Right? If a woman has bia shelo kidarka, is she still a basula or not? Right? It's an interesting shayla. She's still a basula or not? So the Gemara says, Aval bal divrei hakol. So let's listen to this. So the halacha is, everyone agrees that if her husband engages in bia shelo kidarka with her, that makes her a bu'ula. She's no longer a basula. The only time she'll be a basula, ultimately, again, is if it's bia shelo kidarka with other men. For example, the Gemara says, Mahi, what's the case? Tisanya, bo aleh yuranoshim ba'adayin hi basula. Ultimately, again, if she had relations with 10 men. 10 men. It's Tuesday. It's Tuesday, right? So she had relations with 10 men. Va'adayin hi basula, but she's still a basula. And I will say, how does that work? Right? That's bia shelo kidarka. Or is what it's saying is she had relations with 10 men, but the basulim are still intact. Kulan beskila. All of them get skila, I will say, because again, it's considered as if they all had relations with a basula. So Rebbe says, Omer ani harishon beskila v'kulam b'chenek. Rebbe says, no. The first guy gets skila because he had relations with a basula, but after him, even though it's bia shelo kidarka, she's considered to be a ba'ula, and therefore everyone else gets chenek. Okay, Amrav Nachar Bar Yitzchak, Mashkachas La Kigon Shekidsha B'Shtar. So we're just trying to find the case of where Halacha L'Mais Kavnara Murasa. What could be the case? Kidsha B'Shtar. So maybe again he was Mekadesher with the Shtar. Hoil V'Gomer Amotzi Gomer Amachnis. Because everyone would agree that Shtar is one-stop shopping for Kiddushin. Since Shtar fully ends a marriage, Shtar will also fully begin a marriage. Rabbi says, fine, so that's the case. Rabbi Yochanan, Hayu Ba'ala my Avid Bey. Rabbi says, what does Rabbi Yochanan do with this Uba'ala? Homi Baile, Zu Niknis Babia, Vein Ama Ivriya Niknis Babia. Rabbi Yochanan says, this teaches us that only a wife is acquired with Bia, but an Ama Ivriya is not acquired with Bia. How so? Sagadait Chamina, Tisi Vekavachomer, you could have made a Kavachomer from Yavama, Ma Yavama, Shane, Niknis Bekezev, Niknis Babia, a Yavama who cannot be acquired with Kezev is acquired with Bia. Zusha Niknis Bekezev, Inodinsh Niknis Babia. So this woman, right, this Ama Ivriya, who is acquired with Kesef, certainly should be acquired with Bia. Mali Yavama Shekein Zakuka Va'omedes. It's not a good raya, but we'll say a Yavama Zakuka, right? The Yavama is already again within the parsha of marriage, because her marriage is considered to be an extension of the previous marriage, to which the Gemara says, Saganait Cha'amina Ho'eva Kasaf Imacheres Yikachlo Hikisha Kasov La'acheres. I might have thought Rabbi said that by Ama Ivriya, since the pasuk says, if you will marry another woman, she's compared to the other woman. Ma'acheres Mekanya Bia, just like a second wife would be acquired with Bia. Af Ama Ivriya and Mekanya Bia, so to Ama Ivriya can be acquired with Bia. Kamashma, that's not the case. Rabbi say, so bottom line, we're going to stop over here for today. So Rabbi say, so what do we have? If we kind of pull this all back together, what we have is halacha l'maisa, the makar for bia. What is the makar for bia? Uba'ala. Ki yikach ish isha uba'ala. The only reason why Rabbi Avo wanted to learn from Ba'ulas Baal is because he felt that the pasuk of uba'ala may be a little bit misleading, and that it may lead you to think that maybe bia only works if it had some type of preceding process associated with it. Kamash Malan, bia is a fully effective process. ultimately again for going out and affecting Kiddushin. Also, just an interesting aside, that adultery with an Ara Hamurasa, who is a betrothed woman, who is a Besula, is punishable ultimately again by Skila, whereas regular adultery punishable by Chenek. Rabbi Yossi will stop over here for today. Shkoyach. That's before Har Sinai. So in general, we don't learn halachic processes from before Har Sinai. Rabbi Yehuda, Shalom Aleichem. How was Eretz Yisrael? It's great to see you.
That's fresh.
Oh.